So I just did a video on how the mind can't control itself, so it engages in this attempt to control others as a substitute. And I brought up conformity, so I wanted to do a follow-up video explaining the relationship, the close connection, if not just how conformity and control are really the same thing. And so when I talk about the mind, it's important to remember that the mind just didn't pop up out of nowhere. And so many psych books will treat it this way. At best, mine is 40,000 years old, but it has hints of it to go back much, much older. And one of the ways that it helped to survive was this massive rule of conformity, because there's always power in numbers. And the fascinating thing about conformity is that you see it all the way back to bacteria. And so there's a couple examples where if a bacterium doesn't conform to the group, it actually gets shunned, it gets kicked out. And that's pretty fascinating that it would happen at that level. But in humans, it seemed like it really took on almost a qualitatively unique form. And that's why it isn't your mind. It isn't my mind. It's the collective mind. And the best example I can give, and I've talked about this in other videos, but unless you're a Star Trek person, you don't get it, is the Borg. I think the Borg was such a projection of how the mind works. It's a collective. There's no individuality, and that's why you can't control your mind. It isn't yours to control. And so when we talk about controlling others, what we're really talking about is conformity, because that's what conformity is. If you're in a room and everyone stands up and you're sitting, you'll feel this sense that you need to stand. It's a really interesting thing if you've never, I mean, I'm sure you have experienced it. If you go to an event and everyone's dressed up, but you have a t-shirt on, you feel this kind of, ill at ease feeling that you just, you want to go out and buy something a little dressier. And that's the mind. That's the mind. That's how it motivates us. And again, the fascinating thing is people will use the language, will say, well, I feel uncomfortable. And really, it's just the mind that's pushing this type of conformity. And the fascinating thing is it doesn't even matter what the behavior happens to be. So I was at a faculty meeting, this must have been 20 years ago, and a bunch of professors are trying to decide which textbook to use. And there's a lot of talk and conflict and different opinions. And the mind of one professor, I just remember she so clearly articulated it. She said, I don't care what textbook we pick, as long as it's all the same exact one that we all use. And I thought that just something stood out at 20 years ago. It just stood out as the personification of how the mind works in terms of conformity. And maybe that's why they call it monkey mind, because monkeys see, monkey do. And, you look at a conformity in the mind and its motives for conformity, doesn't really know what to do unless it looks around and checks out what other people are doing first. And in that sense, you can get a feel for when the mind is active, because it wants to be part of that group, and it wants to dress the same and stand if everyone's standing and sit if everyone else is sitting. And of course, that's the difference between ordinary people and a Zen master. A Zen master is never under control of his or her surroundings, because they've broken identification with this conformist neuromodule in the left brain. And once they've broken identification with it, then they go back to being part of nature, and they're spontaneous. And that's the interesting thing about nature. Nature doesn't really need this intense level of conformity. A tree doesn't need to look around at other trees to see how high it needs to grow. And then the Zen master has a sense of freedom, because they've explored and recognized this conformity control program we have in our left brain, and they've recognized that that's not who they are.